The threat of federal oversight on artificial intelligence regulation causing concern among New York regulators. Hear from an expert on the current state of AI. Plus, we're looking back at some of the biggest stories out of New York City this year. We'll talk with reporter Henry Rossoff for that roundup. Hello and welcome to Empire State Weekly. I'm John Gray. Before we get to AI, I want to begin with certainly one of the biggest stories of the week. The federal charges against New York's Attorney General Letitia James have been dismissed. A federal judge concluded that the prosecutor handpicked by President Trump to lead the case, Lindsay Halligan, was illegally appointed. James was accused of lying on mortgage paperwork. The case against former FBI Director James Comey also dismissed by this judge in this action. Both cases were dismissed without prejudice. That's key because that means the charges can still be brought again. James released a statement praising the judge's decision, writing in part, "I remain fearless in the face of these baseless charges as I continue fighting for New Yorkers every single day." Justice Department says they do plan to appeal. The Trump administration is holding off now on an executive order targeting state AI regulations. This comes as Congress tries to pass legislation of its own on this matter. The executive order, if eventually signed, would have established a task force within the Justice Department to challenge state regulations and potentially pull federal funding. The controversy coming as Republican lawmakers consider a possible moratorium of up to 10 years for state AI legislation. Some of these laws that the executive order would look to block are right here in New York State. One bill, the Responsible AI Safety and Education Act, looks to require the largest AI companies to create, publish, and follow safety and security baselines. To discuss artificial intelligence and the impact it's having on the nation, we caught up with John Olson, an AI expert and Senior Vice President of Statewide Public Affairs. Let's take a look. Boy, I felt like AI was something that was coming and then it got here in a big hurry and now it seems to be everywhere. This is something getting a lot of attention.
Yeah, I mean, AI has really exploded in the last few years. What we consider AI has really kind of jumped to the forefront with the, adoption of these huge models, these large language models that are trained on a huge amount of data. Like they have access to the breadth of the internet. So that's really what's kind of jump-started this conversation really about the use of AI, the ubiquity of it, and what causes concerns for legislators and policymakers.
Now, do you think that this is something that should be regulated? Yeah,
I do. I think any technology of this magnitude, you have to have guardrails, you have to have sensible legislation. There has to be a balance between driving innovation, but also protecting consumers, and also, giving clarity to companies that are trying to create new technologies and, don't want to be violative of laws, but you have to have some certainty around how you operate in a state or at a federal level.
I feel like John, is a perfect storm here in a bad way of people getting news from little snippets they see on social media, TikTok, Facebook, WhatsApp, or whatever, and deep fakes where somebody will say, well, I used to vote for, I'll pick on Kathy Hochul. I used to like Kathy Hochul, but I saw a clip where she said she doesn't like people who fish. You say, wait, when did she say that? You say, I watched the clip. It was her. I know what she sounds like. I saw her say it.
Yeah.
She was standing by a river and and then if you actually took 5 seconds to research, you say, well, she was never by a river and she never said that and she loves fishing. But people can be fooled if they're not savvy to what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, the sophistication of AI technology where you can create this generated content that looks and sounds genuine. It's concerning, and I think states are really starting to take a look at how can we ensure that companies are disclosing when they're using these technologies, and how do we educate the general public about being more scrutinizing of what they're seeing, what they're hearing. It takes a lot of effort sometimes to really discern whether something's real or not.
And I know it can also be used for good, though.
Absolutely.
Governor Hochul talks about Empire AI. Can you talk a little bit about that, and do you think it's good that these colleges and universities are teaching students how to use this technology for things like climate change and so on and so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a technology, it's life-changing. We've never had something so sophisticated. So, I applaud the governor for the initiative to kind of come together with a number of research institutions, kind of pool resources, invest state, assets, and create a pipeline really for new research, for collaboration, opportunities to collaborate with private companies, and obviously, and chance to put New York on the map in terms of leading on AI.
It also can help in education. Ken, I just saw an interview with a teacher recently. Said we all worry about don't use AI to write your term papers, those things. But then you get to younger kids where you have the smartest kid in the class who's way above everybody, and the one who's struggling. And if they work with AI a little bit, the AI can meet them where they are and recognize, okay, this is a very complex question. It's almost like the computer talks to that smarter kid and challenges him. But with the kid who's struggling, it can bring it down to his or her level and say, well, look at it this way or look at it that way, and then maybe it helps them learn.
Yeah, I mean, there's some level of intuition to it, right? I mean, it's a predictive model, so it kind of learns about you in terms of how you learn, for one, where your struggles might be, and can help tailor lesson plans to make them more personal, make them easier to understand. So yeah, in that sense, as a tool, it's been great. I think there's a lot of opportunity there with the kind of personalization and creating, almost virtual tutors. And they can, certainly assist teachers who may be struggling to find a balance in their lesson plans. So yeah, I mean, when you can tailor it like that, it actually, it creates new opportunities for students to learn the way they have to learn.
I know it's hard to see into the future, but where do you see this technology growing, and where do you expect it to be in the next couple of years?
That's a good question. I think in the most part, it's going to become almost like a daily tool, whether it's for employees, for independent work, for education. The more people become sophisticated in using the technology and in creating the prompts that get them the results that are actually of value, you can filter out a lot of noise, and you can create a lot of efficiencies just in your day-to-day life. So I think that's like really the exciting thing for the general population. And then at a much more like deeper level, the amount of possibilities that come with AI in terms of computation, in terms of creating new medicines, creating new treatments, the applications for healthcare, for personal finance, creating pathways to, developing portfolios that maybe a normal person wouldn't consider. Those are really exciting, and I think where we're heading in the next, say 5 years.
All right, we'll have to have you back on and see where we go next.
It's been a pleasure. I'm happy to come back anytime.
John, thanks for coming in. We do appreciate it.
Thank you.
With the end of the year in sight, we're taking a look back at some of the biggest stories coming out of New York City. Reporter Henry Rossoff also sharing his insight on what will be getting focus in the coming year.
Everything in New York City politics is going to really boil down to relationships relative to the incoming mayor, Mamdani.
Stay tuned for that full discussion. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. Everybody's still talking about this White House meeting between President Trump and New York City Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani. No one predicted it would be as friendly as it was. It's exactly what they saw, at least in front of the cameras. The president and the mayor-elect speaking at a closed-door meeting about issues of affordability in New York City, particularly building more houses and lowering grocery costs. Then the pair appeared in that Oval Office exchange before the press, and the interaction was largely friendly and warm. However, Mamdani's chief of staff says despite the rosy words between the two in public, the mayor did not pull punches when discussing issues like their disagreement over immigration.
In general, the focus here was on what it would mean to make New York City a place where every working family and person can stay. And so we acknowledged, I would say, and signposted many of the differences around ICE, around the National Guard, and yet talked about the more productive areas for potential assistance. So housing and building more housing, for instance, utility costs, and focused primarily in there.
Now, there have been lots more stories surrounding the newly elected mayor, as well as other major elements coming out of New York City. Jamie DeLine caught up with reporter Henry Rossoff from Pix 11 in New York, discussing those stories and more. Here's that conversation.
So, Henry, what would you say are some of the biggest stories out of New York City this year? I'm sure the mayoral race is one of them.
Yeah, I mean, and everything surrounding the mayoral race. What you have to remember is the context for all of this is the corruption case against Mayor Eric Adams, which really came to a head this year once President Trump got into office at the beginning of the year, and then in short order moved to dismiss the case. And as part of that, there were these rumors and indications from federal prosecutors' offices that the mayor was essentially in the pocket of President Trump, which Mayor Adams has firmly denied. But that really turned this into the election that it was, the one that eventually produced Zohran Mamdani, whose stunning primary win is easily the story of the year, accompanied in short order by the fall of former Governor Andrew Cuomo again, and then again in the general election when he tried to run. And then right up until the end of the year, we just keep having political stunner after political stunner with this unbelievable Oval Office meeting that the Democratic Socialist Mamdani, the assemblyman from Queens, had with President Donald Trump. We were expecting them to, have a war of words, and really they killed each other with kindness, which all of us were just kind of blown away by. I was there at the White House for that, and all the reporters, local, national, international, were looking at each other like, what is going on here? So quite an interesting political year indeed.
What's it like covering this? Because I'm sure it must take a lot to, always stay on top of things and stay informed. It must be a little bit exhausting.
Yeah, I mean, it's what you have to understand is that right now Mamdani moves around the city like a literal rock star. I mean, there are no less than 15 to 20 cameras and double that in reporters because of print and radio and whatnot following him around. In Washington, D.C., just recently, there was maybe 100 cameras covering this very high-profile meeting with President Trump. The president himself remarked, I bring in big-time international leaders, and there's not this much interest. And the president is absolutely correct. And I remember covering Mr. Mamdani almost about a year ago when he was at 1%. And we'd message his team and he'd hop on a Zoom, no problem. And now he shows up when, not that he's late or disrespectful, but he shows up when he wants to show up because he's the show right now. I mean, he's the man. And it is, we did not see this with Mayor Adams, who obviously it was a big moment when he won 4 years ago. And then 8 years before that, when Mayor de Blasio ushered in after Bloomberg. I mean, certainly they were popular and interesting and had a lot going on. But this is on another level. Reporters more senior than I compare both the charisma and the coverage of Mamdani to Obama. I mean, there's really nothing else, arguably with the exception of President Trump on the opposite side of the political spectrum, that compares to what's happening with this guy right now.
Now, as we look ahead to the upcoming months in the transition of Mamdani's team, taking over City Hall, what do you think we should be looking for? What could we expect?
Well, we've already seen some really marquee hires. I mean, you have Dean Fulihan, who was the first deputy mayor under Mayor de Blasio, a very serious person, a very well-respected person in Albany. He has been able to maintain Police Commissioner Jessica Tisch and has been steadfast in saying he would not cut the police department, which, despite those promises on the campaign trail, I think a lot of people were leery of him because of past derogatory comments about the police and past positions he held to cut the police. And so those are two really big cornerstone things. But as far as his action item agenda, and to recap it real quick, it's universal child care, it's fast and free buses, and it is freezing the rent for rent stabilized apartments. There's one of those three that can happen very, very quickly. And that is the freeze the rent, because the mayor controls the rent guidelines board, which does this. It'll be a few months before the guidelines board has a chance to do that. But you'll see those appointments in short order. You'll see them basically promising to freeze the rent. And then you'll have the state budget, which I know you'll be intimately involved in covering up there. And that will be the vehicle in March or April or so that we see, well, will he get a portion of the buses free? Let's say express buses, which would be about 10% of the buses in the city. And will he get a commitment to build 50 childcare centers by the end of the year, backed by Governor Hochul, who's indicated that she'll do that. So, I mean, you'll get a sense really within the first few months of the year I mean, the rent thing's going to happen, but on the buses and the childcare, you'll get a sense because of that budget process early next year what the governor's going to let fly in her own election year and what she's not going to let fly.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get a sneak peek in the State of the State address that usually happens in the beginning of January. How would you describe Mamdani's relationship with Governor Hochul?
Increasingly warm. I actually want to point back to what we just talked about with President Trump in the Oval Office, because we've seen this show before. He goes into a meeting with a skeptical House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, and Jeffries walks in and is like, wow, interesting guy. I like what he had to say about affordability. And even he wasn't as warm as President Trump. Walks into a meeting with Governor Kathy Hochul. And, you know, she was a little bit more open than the others he had to convince. But that being said, you know, she was kind of the earliest big endorsement. Not that any of this was early. It took a couple months after the primary, but she came around before Jeffries. You know, Schumer never came around, which is an interesting sort of fraught relationship to watch as we move forward. And then, you know, in that wing of the Democratic primary, you also have Dan Goldman, who met with him. They did not have a particularly good meeting. They do not see eye to eye. And now you have Mamdani pushing Comptroller Brad Lander, who was a close ally during this primary process, to perhaps run against Goldman for Congress. So, you know, everything in New York City politics is going to really boil down to relationships relative to the incoming mayor, Mamdani. And that's going to be the entire story for at least 6 months to a year until the sort of Stefanik Hochul matchup heats up and takes center stage late next year.
We'll have to keep an eye and see what happens. Thank you so much, Henry, for joining us. Always great to speak to you.
Okay, appreciate it.
A fatal incident involving a CUNY peace officer and police, prompting officials to review gun policies across CUNY campuses. When we come back, we'll break down their findings and how the outcome could influence gun laws statewide. Welcome back. The State Inspector General's office looking into the gun policies of safety officers on the CUNY campuses. A new report detailing recommendations for increased gun safety. It's also sparking policy changes for all executive state agencies. Our Jamie DeLine has the story.
The New York State Inspector General's office issued a 25-page report reviewing CUNY's firearm policies and procedures. According to the Inspector General, in 2020, a CUNY peace officer fired shots at 2 NYPD officers during a domestic violence incident.
The peace officer himself was killed by police, and who mercifully, although they were shot themselves, managed to save the woman. What came out of that was an investigation into how it was that this CUNY peace officer had previously violated CUNY's firearms policies. Although in the incident in question, he was using personal firearms, it turned out that he had previously brought his state-issued firearm home and that he had been previously charged with domestic violence incidents.
This incident, as well as a few others involving CUNY public safety staff, are highlighted in the report.
What we found was that across the state agency, there was a wide variety of policies in place. They were inconsistent, many of them lacked update, and they weren't necessarily being enforced as they should have been.
When it comes to firearm safety, Lang shared recommendations across the CUNY system, such as updating all firearm policies, implementing firearm controls such as logbooks and daily locker checks, and mandating fitness for duty reviews after any domestic violence allegation, mental health crisis, or a suspension of a firearm license. This report also resulted in statewide agency changes as well.
In the time since, as we have undertaken this assessment, those policies have been addressed, and now every agency is required to update their policies consistent with best practices and to submit them to the Division of Criminal Justice Services for review and assessment annually.
The Inspector General tells me she hopes this will help stop domestic and firearm violence before it begins. Reporting in Albany, I'm Jamie DeLine.
Now, DCJS did respond. I'm going to quote them now. DCJS is responsible for setting the minimum standards for firearms policies to be followed by all agencies and authorities that employ police and peace officers who carry firearms in the performance of their official duties. Each agency shall review and update its firearms policies by April 1st of 2026 to ensure compliance with these minimum standards. Stick around, back with a look at the week ahead in just a bit. And if you've got a comment or story idea, please tell us about it. You can email us at news@news10.com. We're also on X. You can message us there at WTEN. Finally, on Empire State Weekly, policymakers want students to build healthy financial habits before leaving school. The State Board of Regents adopting a new graduation requirement in personal finance with instruction to begin in the 2026 school year. Topics would include things like budgeting, saving, investing, and managing your debt. The New York State School Boards Association has been lobbying to add personal finance instruction, and they're urging school boards to approve this resolution and support the idea. Next week, we're going to look to hear from education advocates on this issue and other issues that the schools will face in the coming school year. For now, from all of us here at Empire State Weekly, I'm John Gray. Thanks for watching. We'll see you right here next week. And don't forget, you can watch this show all over New York State. Here's the full schedule of Empire State Weekly on 10 TV stations across the great state of New York.